Welcome to the Blue Ridge True Crime Podcast, keeping history alive, one crime at a time. I'm your host, Alfred Dockery. I'm excited today to be talking with Trevor McKenzie, author of Otto Wood, the Bandit, and we're also going to cover a ballad behind Otto Wood and Appalachian Ballads in general. Trevor, could you briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, so I'm Trevor McKenzie. I'm the author of the aforementioned book, Otto Wood, the Bandit, the Freighthopping Thief, Bootlegger, and Convicted Murderer behind the Appalachian Ballads. A friend and mentor, Sandy Ballard, said that I needed a roll-out business card for that title.
Agreed.
The press thought it would be a great idea to hit all the high points and gain some interest. I like the title, I should say.
It's solid. Just hit the highlights of who Otto Wood was for the folks out there who have not been doing their Appalachian homework.
Okay, great. So probably the most easy entry access point to Otto Wood's story is the ballad, which was revived in the 1960s by a fellow named Doc Watson. Really, I mean, internationally popular purveyor of flat-picking guitar and also a great folk singer, a banjo player, and a carrier of Appalachian music traditions. Doc went back and revisited an old ballad that he had learned from a record that his dad had secured through a trade of some boxwood shrubs. He had traded for a bunch of 78s that their neighbor had. And Doc remembered this ballad, which is an outlaw ballad. And so the story of Otto Wood is told in this 78 RPM form. So he was from Wilkes County, just down the hill from Watauga County, where Doc Watson's was from. And so Wood's story starts in 1893. He was born in Wilkes County, and by the time he was killed on the streets of Salisbury in New Year's Eve of 1930, he had escaped from 5 different state penitentiaries 11 different times. He was known as the Houdini of Cell Block A. A slippery character, as they say, and was in and out of penitentiaries all of his life and in a lot of smaller jails that it's hard to even track down. He was a thief. He was a car mechanic. He was really skilled at hot wiring automobiles as soon as they arrived on the scene. A real all-around character.
Yeah, he's very impressive for accomplishing all these things with a club foot and being missing a left hand.
Yes.
But that hardly slowed him at all.
No, not at all. Wood very much participated in his own myth making. As much as the ballad has built up myths about him since his death, he very much partook in creating his own legendary image. He claimed that he was missing his left hand from a railroad accident, the Norfolk and Western at that time, as it was known, railroad company. But it turned out that was completely a fabrication. We have detailed evidence of him trying to rob a rabbit trap from one of his neighbors and having a shotgun leaned up next to him. He would have been around 18 years old when this happened. And the shotgun slipped. He tried to grab for it, and he caught the load of the shotgun in his hand, and it had to be amputated by a nearby doctor. I found the evidence of someone recounting that story, and also the evidence that the doctor lived right next door or just down the road from the Wood family and likely performed that operation.
Yeah, he reminds me of 2 fellows I've written about, Lewis Redmond, the Moonshine King of the Carolinas,
Yes.
and Jesse James, both of which were more than willing to bend the ear of a sympathetic journalist and tell stories that had very little in common with reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we forget how much these characters in the pre-social media era were operating in the same way that people do now. They were projecting an image out there for people. Someone like Wood, he read newspaper accounts of his own crimes and participated in this dialogue about himself. He's someone that I think would have loved social media. He would have very much been jumping in the comments section of videos about his own crimes. So,
In reading the book, I really felt for you, having done some episodic chapters about various scofflaws and ne'er-do-wells. He was a criminal whirlwind. He's almost like a Mad Lib. You just change the make of the car and the state and the type of crime and the prison or jail that he broke out of. And it just rinsed, lathers, and repeats. He was everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and there is a sort of his own storytelling that he had in his life's history, which was published from behind bars in North Carolina State Prison in 1926. He self-published and sold, I think, around 1,000 copies, and maybe a reprint of his many more of those. This life story that he had, he told all of these tales of being in Texas and fighting against bandits down there. I was surprised in digging into his story. Like you said, this Mad Lib where he shows up at all these different places, he actually appears on the Mexican border running stolen cars across the border during the 1910s and early 1920s under the name of Jennings, which is just a completely, you couldn't invent something like that. What's crazy is he hid that real history behind this sort of dime novel Texan, tall in the saddle kind of imagery of cowboy movies and dime novels of that era, and really obscured his actual crimes in that region. So, yeah, he turns up in Texas, he turns up in Kentucky, he turns up in Ohio, all of these places under different names and assumed identities.
Yeah, in reading your book, his adventures in North Carolina, it seems like every town I have been to in North Carolina, he got there ahead of me. I mean, he was everywhere. He was Salisbury, Wilkesboro, Raleigh, going through Asheville on the way to Tennessee. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you, as you say in your book, he escaped 11 times from 5 different state prisons. I just wanted to get your thoughts on what made him such a good escape artist.
I think his key secret weapon was sympathy. He was missing his left hand from the time he was around his late teens. He had a clubbed left foot, which always caused him to walk with a slight limp. He had a charming personality. I would say the combination of that sort of appeal for sympathy based on his physical, sort of attributes and the way he carried himself, but then also the way that he just had this personality that built this legend around himself. He was very much a somebody who could play into this cult of celebrity. I talk in the book, especially in the period of 1926, it was almost like a modern news conference he's holding from behind his cell. Behind cell bars, there are people coming to visit him. I think the combination of his physical representation of himself to people and what some people viewed as handicaps, and also his disarming personality, which really took people in. I think he could make himself seem trustworthy to people. You see time and time again, for every miraculous escape that he pulls off, riding out of prison in a train car, or, somehow removing the hinges from the outside of his cell, or driving the prison doctor's car out of the prison gates in broad daylight. We have those images, but then also for every one of those we have, basically he was on a chain gang duty and was seen as only suitable to be the water boy because of his handicaps, and then it turns out that he just walks away and disappears. I think that was one of his most used escape tactics, gaining people's trust and then just slipping away without them noticing.
Yeah, I recall there was a point where the newspaper reporters would just talk about Otto going on his annual vacation. It just became so routine for him to be basically out roaming the countryside in a stolen car.
Yes, it was by his third escape. You have things like college students in Chapel Hill writing him into their senior superlatives, or as best runner or something like that. He becomes sort of a joke. He would have been the meme in this time period. This fella has his own world unto himself as a celebrity. and people participate in that and buy into that image in a big way.
Now, he finally wound up getting 30 years for second-degree murder because he killed a pawnbroker in Greensboro, a man named Kaplan, by clubbing him over the head with a firearm.
Yes. When you're clubbing somebody over the head with a firearm, you mean to do them harm. Wood makes very weak arguments in his participation in this debate about whether he killed Kaplan, whether his intentions were to kill Kaplan. I think we should just look at it on the surface that he meant this person violence. Sometimes a byproduct of that violence is the death of someone. If you mean them harm, that is always there. I enjoy tracing Wood's story. When you're tracing the story of someone like this, you get taken in and you want to root for them, especially when you're writing about criminals. I think that's a good place to stop. Sometimes you can be taken in. These are alluring figures, especially from this era that Wood was in. He was kind of the precursor to this Depression era desperado idea that we have. And so there's so much myth making around people like that, especially someone later like John Dillinger or Pretty Boy Floyd. But you can only let the personality go so far before you hold this person accountable, just like the law tried to back then.
Yeah, his entire argument appeared to boil down to, I didn't hit him that hard.
Exactly, which is a very shaky ground to begin a defense with in a courtroom, and it proved as much. But what's interesting about that is you even see from the courtroom, the judge has sympathy on Wood. There's a dialogue around Wood's case where the judge says, I would have handed first degree, but now seeing you and seeing your circumstances, I will hand down a sentence for second degree, which basically spares Wood's life. He pioneered solitary confinement in North Carolina by being kept on death row because it was the only secure place for Wood to be.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of repetition to the story in that if they left him in the general population, you would turn around at some point and he would be gone. But when you put him in solitary, he really failed to thrive. His health even seemed to be threatened. And then so they would let him out and off he goes into the countryside.
Yes. And I think it's interesting that when he was first put into solitary confinement, there's this miraculous story which I've had to unpack for several people, that he is shot in the chest, and it even repeats that in this ballad about him. He was, second time they caught him was way out west in a hold-up game. He was shot in the breast or chest, depends on who's singing the line. He is shot almost directly below the heart, almost at point-blank range over a counter in Terre Haute, Indiana. You would think that would be the end of someone's story. Somehow he had change in his pocket that deflected the bullet just enough so that it didn't hit any vital organs. If you're writing this into a film script or some kind of visual medium, you would have a hard time having people believe that person is not out of the story at that point.
Very much. So this brings us to Salisbury, where Otto, when confronted by a sheriff and a policeman, decides, instead of surrendering or running, decides to shoot it out.
The song, the ballad itself, begs this question. The version, especially the ones revived by Doc Watson and written by Walter Kidd Smith and the Carolina Buddies shortly after this final shootout as a means to cash in on this story, Wood was known for running. And whenever he had the chance, he would either surrender and wait for another opportunity to run, or just outright run from the law each time that he was caught or cornered. It's surprising in this case that he decides to make a stand. And I think it was surprising to people that he was killed in this way. A shootout in broad daylight over the top of the hood of a car in the streets of Salisbury on New Year's Eve. I will say that this is another point that I take Wood to task for. As charming as he is, he has a compatriot with him, Roy Banner Barker, who he had picked up in the coal fields of Southwest Virginia. Wood had connections to southern West Virginia, just over the line in the coal fields there. And so he had met this person and brought them to Wilkes County. They had spent the Christmas season around Wilkes County together. And he gives Roy Barker a pistol. However, the obtaining of this weapon that he gives Barker are basically that kids are in the yard. I've heard local tales about this in Wilkes County of kids out in the yard playing with this broken pistol. And he basically buys it and gives it to Barker. And it turns out that this is not even a functioning weapon. And so during this shootout, where Wood is trying to commandeer the car of these policemen and get them to drive him out of town so he can make an escape, that goes awry. Basically, Wood and the policemen spill out of this car and start shooting at each other over top of the hood. He is calling the entire time for his partner, Barker, to open fire, knowing that this pistol does not work. And so it kind of gives you an idea of Wood's character, that he is willing to sacrifice this person to draw the fire away from him, to at least try to make one last break once he, wrongheadedly decides to take this stand against the police. I think he realized it was a bad idea pretty quick to have ever put it on me.
Yeah, in several incidents, it seems like he viewed his accomplices as more or less expendable.
Yes. And this is very much a dark part of Wood's story. There are many dark pieces, but there's also the light kind of, sepia-toned hue that we can give this era of him bounding out through the hills of Wilkes County, escaping and going out west into the Midwest. The romantic idea of this era that we have, and it's hard not to have that sort of vision of this when you think of the story. But when you start to pick apart these threads, you see a person who definitely sees other people as expendable as long as he can make good his escape.
Let's segue into the ballad. Now, as a writer, I find the ballad to be just a jewel, just a masterpiece. It starts out by telling you, hey, I got a story for you, and there's a few gaps in here, and y'all just gonna have to come with me.
Yes, which is kind of the ballad tradition. I love this era of Appalachian balladry because it's where Appalachian balladry has become, because of colliding with this recording industry, this new era of what becomes the country music industry that's with us today. It becomes self-aware of this art form that's been handed down. It's a traditional form of Appalachian storytelling, taking elements from our European, African, and Native tradition, colliding like a lot of music here. But it's using this old form and being like, hey, we've only got 3 minutes tops on this record. So buckle up. It's going to be fast. It's going to be a brisk ballad, and it's going to be up to the times, and it's going to get enough of the story across that you're interested in this character. And so, yeah, just it's fascinating how this comes together. And of course, the version you're talking about is the first version of the ballad that was sort of written as an original by Walter Kidd Smith, who is from around Statesville, North Carolina, and his Carolina buddies. Smith actually, in an interview, said that he saw an alternative version of himself in Otto Wood. When someone later asked him why he wrote the song, he saw someone who was around his same age who had taken a different path in life. I also think what Smith saw was a way to bank in on a news story. This idea of fusing this ballad tradition with the next hit country record. You had people at this time who were making records like the Carter family, who were coming out of these traditional sounds, but also becoming the first country music superstars. Charlie Poole, who's just down the road from where we're talking about in North Carolina, is selling records and going to New York to record with bands. He was very much a contemporary of Wood and Kidd Smith as well, and an outlaw character in his own right, if we wanted to dive into Charlie Poole sometime. So anyway, it's this kind of idea of like, here is this marketable story that could be of interest. People are reading about it in the paper. They will buy records of this ballad. And people are so aware of that Walter Kid Smith takes this. He shops this ballad around to several record companies. And when he gets to the Victor recording studio, there is somebody there taking notes who he does not know and does not appear to be part of the staff. It's a completely different Smith, Slim Smith, who is also trying to become a country music star, who takes down the ballads, gets a couple of news articles of Otto Wood, writes his own ballad, and releases it a month before Walter Kid Smith's recording can even make it to record. And so we have this other recording of Otto Wood, the Bandit, that is sung by Slim Smith, a locksmith from Mississippi who's trying to make it big in country music. His only problem is that he was not a talented musician. I don't think he could even play a chord on the guitar. So he had to hire whoever the session band was for the Victor Recording Studios, which was King Benny Nawahu's Hawaiians. And so this is that version of Otto Wood the Bandit, released earlier than the one we know that everyone sings now, is the only Appalachian ballad I can think of that you can hula dance to. Because it's a swinging jam session of Hawaiian shredding steel guitar in the background with somebody chanting out these sort of semi-Appalachian ballad lyrics. There's even an earlier version I'd be remiss not to mention. You spoke of Jesse James earlier. There's the old ballad of Jesse James, was quickly reworked by the Red Fox Chasers, who released their own version. They were from Allegheny County, just up the hill from where Wood was born, and so they were practically neighbors. It's not too far from Allegheny down the mountain into Wilkes. So we have three versions of competing ballads, and only one of them survives with us today in tradition. Appalachian ballad tradition, it's something that when people think of this region, it's one of the cultural traditions that really draws people in, this sort of story song tradition that we have here. And of course, it pulls its strength from older European ballads from over there. And, specifically we think of Scotland, Ireland, the British Isles, largely we think of those. But all over Europe, there was this tradition of ballad singing. To illustrate the progression of balladry, one of my favorites that I like to throw into sets sometimes, I play music, I perform a little bit of Appalachian music. I grew up playing traditional Appalachian music, and I play fiddle a lot with bands around, so just try to sneak some of these older songs into the set. One that I really enjoy is actually a supernatural ballad. A lot of those elements didn't make it into the ballad traditions that migrated over here from the old world. So this one's kind of a neat standout in that way. It's called The Richest Girl in Our Town, or The Suffolk Miracle. It was collected by two professors at Appalachian State, Cratus Williams and Dr. W. Amos Abrams, who were early ballad collectors in the 1920s through the 40s, went around to rural communities around North Carolina and, in Cratus's case, in eastern Kentucky, and collected these ballads. And so this specific one they got from Pat Fry, who was a miller from Yadkin County, and he was an older person at the time they recorded him in the 1940s, so I think he was around 80 years of age. He had gone blind, and he had learned this song from his mother and sang it to himself for years. It's this story of a young man who falls in love with a woman above his station, and the woman's father sends her away to a neighboring town. Back in that era, that's basically being exiled. During that time, her lover dies, and she comes back and lives with her father. One night, this lover returns from the grave, and they go on a midnight ride together. She turns back up at her father's house, and her father's like, "Where have you been?" And she says, "I've been out with my love. He's come back for me." And her father knows that this man is laying in the grave. And they go and dig up his grave, and they find her handkerchief, which she had bound around his aching head because he had complained that he felt sick during the ride. They find it around the skull of this skeleton that's in the grave. So it's a revenant ballad. It's a whole tradition of storytelling that we can unpack from European traditions of people coming back from the grave That's my favorite one for around Halloween times, especially.
One of the things that struck me is that you'll find these ballads played at kind of a slow, somber pace.
Mhm.
And then you'll find a different artist in a different time, and they are just banging away like a Highland fling. And I was just curious what observations you had for me about that, given your background as a musician.
Yes, I think a lot of this music is bound up in dancing in some ways. And so I think there's sort of a back and forth between the performance music and the storytelling music, and then also the dance. And a lot of these fiddle bands, especially the string bands that are still a strong tradition in this region, we want things to be danceable and accessible. If we can put it in a time signature that gets people up and moving their feet, or couple dancing, or doing their own steps, flat footing, buck dancing, or clogging, however that works, you twist these tunes to suit the format that you need them to work for. So you have tunes like Poor Ellen Smith that could be sung really slow as a dirge. But then a lot of recordings you hear people playing it up to speed. It is a dance beat. It's a danceable tune. And it's very striking to see people dancing to this description of a very real murder that happened in Forsyth County in the early 1900s. So you have this whole thing kind of back and forth of it. And I think traditional music is always that kind of dialogue. It's always a pulling and pushing and pulling of what is this music needed for? And sometimes you need it for a dance, sometimes you need it for entertainment. A lot of these ballads were generated as a way to tell stories and to give people the news. Especially further back in the traditions, these were sung for half pennies on the streets in Europe. It was a way for people to get their news, and the tunes that they were set to were familiar, and they were malleable, and you could set them to many different traditional tunes. And you also have the interaction of the sacred and the secular. Poor Ellen Smith is a perfect illustration. The tune that's most commonly sung is "How Firm a Foundation." Nobody would ever dance to "How Firm a Foundation" in an Appalachian community, but if you sing Poor Ellen Smith and you play that "How Firm a Foundation" melody, but a couple of beats per minute faster, people will be up on the floor dancing. So it's really a study in what our culture here is in Appalachia and rural North Carolina more broadly, this sort of push and pull between sacred and secular, and this storytelling, but also community dances and how communities get together and reinvent themselves.
Occasionally even get emails from people who will say, you wrote about my great grandfather, or I didn't know this story about my family. And one of the things that has been very positive for me is that generally they aren't angry. They're actually interested, and they're glad that the story continues. And with the Appalachian Ballads, and with a lot of the scholarship, and even just the somewhat random writings of folks like Scott and myself.
Yes, I understand that. I had heard some people that talked about interactions with some friends of mine wrote a play at a newspaper down in Wilkes County. They wrote a play about Otto Wood that was performed as an outdoor drama, and I played as part of the band for that, the Elkville String Band. There was a lot of Wilkes County musicians involved in that. They had also formed years earlier for another outdoor drama about Tom Dooley, which, it's kind of crazy to think that two of the biggest Appalachian crime ballads come from Wilkes County with Tom Dooley and Otto Wood. Both of them have been re-examined by these community pageants that are put on. My friends who had put on that outdoor drama had a mixed reaction from people about it, and they had talked about getting some feedback from some people who said they were Wood's family, who were not so impressed with the portrayal of him, which I found very sympathetic. In my own case, I was pleasantly surprised that one of Otto's descendants, his great grandson, reached out to me recently. Um, we have kind of developed a friendship and check in on each other every once in a while. And he kind of filled in some gaps that I had, photographs of people that I could only imagine that we, really didn't have access to. I didn't have access to when I was writing the book. And, I think that I think that people, when they're honest about their history and they really dig into it, it's hard to have someone like Wood in your family. As much as he's a folk hero, folk legend, anti-hero, we could call him folk anti-hero, I should say. When you get to the reality of it, he is a complicated and sometimes he's a villainous character, or else we wouldn't be talking about him. It's been neat for me to see how that family has unpacked that. This descendant shared with me that some of the family had that they had filled with all of their things we keep in closets, and he crawled in there as a kid and found this box, and it was a record with the Bandit, and underneath it, newspaper clippings of this person he had never heard of, and that looked a lot like some people in his family. And so they had held on to that history, but they had literally buried it. They had stuck it away in their home. Sometimes it's painful for us to unpack things. I tried to give grace and put things into footnotes that might make an uncomfortable story about their family. And so I buried some of those things in the footnotes because they weren't important to moving Wood's story forward. But also I wanted to include him. And so I was pleasantly surprised that they had not taken offense to that, and their family had done that same thing of being like, let's just put this under here because that's not really helping us move forward or tell this story in a way that would engage people. So yeah, it's interesting, the process of presenting this sometimes when you're dealing, especially in your background with this podcast and with your own writings, you're dealing with these hyper local subjects that still are very on the sleeve for people. You want to be cognizant of that, and you want to be a good neighbor to people without telling outright lies about our own history.
So you tread carefully and you try and be respectful and you try and tell a good story. And there have been stories that I've come across that were really interesting and quite involved where I just decided I'm not doing this one.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Now, do you have any projects that you'd like people to be aware of or places I can send people to learn more about your work?
Yes, my day gig is the director of the Center for Appalachian Studies at Appalachian State. We have a master's program that dives into regional history, the political conception of Appalachia, the cultural traditions of the region, and the importance of the environment and the unique ecology here. Anyone interested in that, we have a program in Boone. We also have a lot of resources surrounding that. For my own part, I play music around. I'm involved in a lot of different festivals and playing at regional venues. And I keep sometimes updated on social media, on Instagram mostly, where I'm playing. So if people want to follow me, my handle is at Tallest Hemlock, which is a goofy nickname that was given to me by a friend of mine that I used to host a traditional music radio show with here in Boone. So anyway, I'm working on another book about Appalachian ballads. You very much caught me with that in the front of my brain here, about ballads that were actually written in Appalachia and sort of tracing the history of the region through those ballads. Not just murder ballads, and not just crime ballads, which is kind of what people think of, but sort of these local historical ballads that people sort of documented all the way back into the 18th century and moving up into our era now. That's a massive project I have going on, hopefully for UNC Press again. There's an album that a friend of mine and I, Steve Kruger, who is a folklorist who now lives in Virginia, but both of us spent a lot of time learning music around Western North Carolina from tradition bearers and friends. It's called The Freshet, and it's actually hinged kind of around a ballad from 1916 when there was a giant hurricane in the region.
Oh, yeah.
After our experiences here in the fall of 2024, my town, Nash County, Lansing, was underwater, flooded. We experienced the flood here out towards the section where I live. It's been a bit rough. We revisited that recording, which we had never released. We had never quite found the time, funds, or the drive to release it. It felt like the right time. So we released that album. as a fundraiser for mutual aid, which we raised some off of the digital album. And then some friends at Buncombe County Special Collections, they have a Carolina record collective there, are helping us produce a vinyl edition, which will also go to mutual aid. There will be a solid recording of this ballad. It's sort of a communication between that 1916 event and our 1924 event, our 2024 Hurricane Helene event, which we're still recovering from here. So,
yeah, be sweet to have something out on vinyl.
And a friend of mine who is an archivist, Catherine Cutshaw, who works in the Pack Library there, Buncombe County Special Collections, reached out and said, we have this as part of our library, and we think we would love to have a vinyl edition of this to add to our collection. And I said, there's no possibility of us doing that. Her and the Buncombe County Special Collections, along with their friends of the library and the Carolina Record Collective, put funds together. I also had some friends here in our part of northwestern North Carolina, Real Companion Records, the Watauga River Social Club, and the North Carolina Arts Council. They're sort of branches up here, all threw in money to help make this project come together and make it free for us to produce, to actually raise funds that will go back to communities impacted by Hurricane Helene. It's a very small initiative, but it's something that kind of combines the history and the awareness that this is not just a one-off event in this region. This has happened before, and we can be prepared for it again and rebuild these communities.
That's it for this episode of Blue Ridge True Crime Podcast. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with a friend. I'll see you on the back roads.